Can you just tell me a little bit about what you study and research, and what you're hoping to learn there in Egypt?
Sure. For 10, 15 years now, I've studied young people who live in very difficult circumstances. In my case, I've chosen to study young people who live through political conflict. And so it was natural to be interested in coming to Egypt, given that this revolution that has been taking place here was driven by young people. And so I jumped at the chance to come. I have experience studying other young people in different parts of the world, and therefore have some sense of what to expect from youth.
Right. Where else have you studied in the past?
Most of my work has been in the Palestinian territories. So I studied in the mid-90s, starting in the mid-90s, I studied Palestinian youth in the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem and the West Bank who had just emerged from the First Intifada, as it's known, which was another example of a movement in which youth were very heavily involved. I've also studied Bosnian youth, and those would be the two kind of case studies that I have substantial field work in, and of course we are aware of and otherwise study youth in various parts of the world.
And what have you learned from those two cases?
Well, I learned a lot of things that really were in some ways surprising to me. When I first went to the Palestinian territories, it was my first experience living with and studying people in very difficult circumstances. And as you probably remember, that 6-year-long struggle was quite violent, and young people were exposed daily to harsh circumstances, and also participated in initiating quasi-violence in terms of throwing rocks and so on. I had expected that they would be traumatized by their experiences being exposed to so much violence. What I found was that was not the case, that they were a group of young people who were full of purpose, full of ambition and hope for the future, and talked very little about any type of difficulties they'd experienced. I was so surprised by that. As you might know, many of our theories in the West focus on trauma model. We have this notion that young people are not able to withstand the challenges of life, and so I was surprised by that finding, and that's when I chose to go to Bosnia and study a similar population of young people who had been through a long war and were also the same religion and some cultural similarities. And I found there what we would expect to find everywhere, and that is a population of young people who were very, very troubled by their past experiences and had very great difficulty getting past them. So this presented us with a real challenge to understand why it might be that one population of young people would fare reasonably well and another population not. And what I concluded from that comparison was that much of the outcome of involvement in difficult circumstances, especially ones that are informed by political issues, much of the outcome is influenced by the degree to which young people who are participating have an appreciation or an awareness of what it is that's at stake, why this conflict is happening, what its goals are, what its justifications are, so forth. So in the case of the Bosnians, they had none of that. The war descended upon them unpredictably, literally from one day to the next. They didn't know why it was happening. They didn't know who the enemy was, in fact, until they saw the markings on the tanks and so forth. They really were taken by total surprise, and no one, particularly their parents, could explain to them what was this conflict all about. Why were they being attacked, or this and that? And so they were totally unprepared to contextualize the adversity, and therefore suffered from it. In the Palestinian case, the reverse was true. The conflict didn't surprise them. It was one in a series of conflicts that they heard about through their fathers and grandfathers. They had a sense of why it was happening. They had a sense of its goals. They had a clear objective in the movement and the occupation. And they had the opportunity to actually participate, to express themselves, and they were the leaders of that movement, for example. So this kind of what we call meaning, identity relevant meaning, I think is critical in explaining how young people and the older people as well, how we respond to the challenges that we face. Here in Egypt, we would expect much the same outcome as we saw among the Palestinian youth, in the short term at least, because it's obvious that these young people are clear about what the goals of this revolution are, and that they have taken the opportunity to express themselves, and as we've seen, they have achieved remarkable success in meeting those goals. Although I can tell you from being on the ground here now that some of that is not so clear anymore, and their demonstrations are beginning again because they are seeing that some of the changes that were promised are not forthcoming. So it will be very interesting to watch them in the next few days to see what happens. But they clearly are very aware and directed and focused, and all of that speaks positively to their future in terms of adapting to the challenges that they face.
And what role has, I guess, social media and the internet and the ability to organize in that way really played in this, particularly with the youth?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, or one of them, for this revolution. It seems to be the case that social media played a fundamental and instrumental role in the success of this revolution, such that it appears, and this is exactly what I'm talking to the youth about as I interview them here, it appears that much of the planning, the foreplanning actually of the revolution, so before January 25th, when it officially started, much of it was accomplished via social media technology. So people were talking to each other via various methods of Facebook and Twitter. What the Western press has not got enough of, apparently, is that YouTube also played a big role as well. And so kids were communicating broadly, and a leadership developed. And I can give you, for example, today, I'm working, my interpreter is a 21-year-old Egyptian woman who was very much involved in the protests. And last night we were meeting together, and she became aware that that some demonstrations were planned for today. And she got 5 invitations from different people, from Facebook friends, I guess you call them, informing her and everyone else that indeed demonstrations were planned for 2 o'clock today. And that's how the news spread. And apparently that was was done on a massive scale before and during the revolution, such that people were immediately aware of the process and the strategies that were undertaken.
And so what's your methodology there as far as collecting information and data from the Egyptian citizens and the youth?
We have what we call a multi-method approach, so we're going to hit this from a variety of angles. What I've learned in working in cultures that are foreign to the researcher is that one must start by listening. And so our first method is by face-to-face interviews with young people, one-on-one or in groups. As you know, we need permission to do that from the Institutional Review Board at the University of Tennessee, which is established to protect the subjects of research. And so I'm just hearing today back on the approval of our strategy, so that starting tomorrow, it seems, I can actually have formal interviews, and I'll record those interviews with individual young people or groups of young people, and we listen carefully to those, we study them carefully to see what it is that is, what the major themes are, what the issues are that the youth are talking about, and then that helps us frame larger scale methodologies where we'll probably create questionnaires or surveys that ask questions relative to the content that we learn from the youth in the interviews. And we will likely, given appropriate funding, we'll do a national survey of young people, so we'll get a sense of how young people throughout the entire nation have been involved or aware of this. And now, in this specific case, to the point of your question, so we'll get finally a valid sense of just how critical social media was in the country as a whole, and whether that was just limited to local Cairo.
How long does it take to do a study like that, and how long are you planning to be in the country?
Mid-March, when I'm due to go to the West Bank, where we're conducting another project that's already been funded there. So I've got a couple of weeks here. We'll certainly get a good start on it. We'll interview for the next 2 weeks. We'll probably spend most of those days going from city to city, interviewing young people. And then it takes a long time to process that. We'll transcribe those recordings and we'll study them. I suspect that if we get the funding, we will then create the survey, and maybe in a few months we'll be ready to do the national survey. And then I would point out that the most important methodology here, and this is the one that we're following in the Palestinian project I just mentioned, is that the limitation of most past work on young people is that we as researchers or the media come in and study the issues as they're happening, and then we get sidetracked and move on after the drama is over, and we don't follow the young people as they move forward with their lives. So again, given the funding that we're going to be requesting, we will follow a carefully selected subset of young people that I meet here. We'll follow them over time, so we'll come back and interview them 6 months from now, and a year from now, a year and a half from now, for example, and see if we can pin down just how this amazingly powerful revolution plays itself out as they move forward with their lives.
And will those results be impacted by what happens in the country in the next 6 months to a year? I mean, as far as where the country itself goes from here?
Do you mean the conduct of the research or the findings we might make?
the findings? I mean, as you revisit these folks a year from now.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I'm certain already that one of the reasons this revolution has been so successful already is not just the fact that youth are impassioned and organized and willing to demonstrate endlessly. That's not enough. There's been a co-occurrence of forces here, and to say it most simply is that the response to the protests has figured heavily into the success of the movement. So as you see today in the news from Libya, there are other ways that leaders respond to the protests, and the Libyan method so far is to try to beat the protests down and to intimidate them and to conduct awful violence against them. So many people are being killed in Libya right now. That didn't happen here in Egypt, and that needs explanation, but the fact of it explains in large part the success. So your question is right on target. That is, how the government continues to respond to the legitimate demands of the young people will figure very heavily into how they process this moment. Thus, as I said before, they're concerned already that there hasn't been substantial change, and so they're going back to the streets. And it seems to me that they're dedicated enough to continue until they effect further change. But if that doesn't happen, or a new regime takes over that doesn't respect the legitimate demands, then the youth are set up to be disappointed, to be discouraged, to adopt other means, perhaps, or to just resign and leave the country, or become apathetic and so forth. So much depends on how the organizational structures that exist in society, both government and civil, move forward to accommodate the progress that the youth have initiated.
Do you have any sense of what will happen in the country going forward?
I don't. I'm certainly not an expert on Egypt, and I wouldn't have any expert to forecast as to how things will happen. I can say though that it's obvious that certain factors speak for optimism. First, the youth's passion and their commitment to civil disobedience, but also the military. The military's role is so critical here, and it's obvious as I walk the streets and join these demonstrations that the military is a friend or a protector of the people. There is harmony between the military and the people, and that's unusual. And there's no reason to think that will change. So the prospects of eventual substantial change, I think, are much higher than they would be in a country where the military was in line with the regime that is being contested. So I can't imagine a better recipe for success, but who knows?
And do you have any sense of how this revolution here and the youth in this country and that movement compares to what else is going on in the region? I mean, obviously there's a contrast with Libya, but some of the other countries?
Well, we shouldn't forget that even the Egyptian revolution was preceded by what happened in Tunisia.
Right.
We forget quickly, but that Egypt would not have happened had Tunisia had not happened. And so there is this ripple effect, and I, as you only consume the news as we get it from those other regions, but it would seem that in most of the cases that are following this case, that the regimes that are being challenged are choosing to contest and to try to control away the protests. And I don't know that any of us can predict which country is going to respond in which way, but I think it's very clear that we can predict that youth around the world have been empowered by this, and there will be no end soon to efforts to try to address grievances which are deeply felt.
When you talk about youth, what sort of age range are we talking about?
It's another really good question, and there's not a clear answer, unfortunately, because cultures vary substantially as to how they define that term. So there are countries that define youth from anywhere down to 12 years of age to up to 30 years of age, or even higher. And so it's really kind of a loose term that we should be careful about using. Here it appears to be what we would consider what we would in the United States would consider adolescence, so late adolescence, up through 30 years old. That seems to be the age range of most of the young people who are certainly involved in the social media part of things.
And what is the scene there now? I know you arrived sort of on the back end of the initial protests and whatnot. So, I mean, I know that there's also this fear of chaos and instability, but there on the ground, what are you seeing?
Well, the first thing is that I don't sense that there is a fear among the people of chaos or instability. So it's been good to be able to see or feel here on the ground that doesn't seem to be the concern. Quite literally, I can describe that. Cairo is a dense and complicated major city. Most of the demonstrations seem to be centered around this particular area where actually I'm looking out over on right now. The Tahrir Square, as you keep hearing about, it's just a roundabout that has a grassy or dirt area, which may be 300 yards in diameter. And that's where most of the stuff happens. Of course, it spills over when hundreds of thousands come. But what I've seen since Friday, I've been here now just a few days, is that the mornings are pretty much what you'd expect, calm, lots of traffic going back and forth, and then by the afternoons you see people start making their way towards this area, and they're carrying Egyptian flags and waving them, and sometimes they're singing, and they start to gather. And then on days like today, when formal protests are announced, then they move at a specified time, and you have these protests going on. Meanwhile, the heavy traffic of the city is whizzing by, and life goes on as the protests go on.
Are people starting to talk about elections and what's going to happen next? And
they were talking about elections recently, like last week apparently, before I got here. And there was even some forecasting that elections would happen in 6 months or so. But what I'm sensing clearly now in the last few days is that's off the table, because there are these newfounded concerns that Mubarak, or advisors are still running things. And so I think no one is clear at this point as to when the next phases will occur. What people seem to be demanding now is the full resignation of all ministers, and that will be the first step. I think they thought, and we thought from the outside that had happened when Mubarak resigned, but apparently it didn't happen. That has to happen first, and then the military, who is supposed to be in charge of the government, needs to go through the process of writing a new constitution and preparing and defining, designing elections. And the youth are ready to participate, and they're forming political parties. But what I'm speaking to now is the likelihood that that's going to be farther down their road than one may have thought last week.
Right. When we talk about the military being in charge right now, who is there a head of the military, or who is at that top leadership?
Well, your questions are really very good questions, and again, let me tell you, I'm not an expert on each. But what's murky is that Mubarak was a military man, famous general, and virtually all of his main advisors come from the military. That's different, however, than the armed forces, which are literal armed forces that have their own leader, and of course he's a military leader, and they're fine. The people want the armed forces to lead the government provisionally until a civilian government is installed. But they don't want any part of the residual military leaders who have become the political leaders over the last 3 decades. They want all of them gone.
Right.
Today there was a lot of talk about they kept using an English word. They want a technocratic government, and it took me a while to figure out what they were saying. They're talking about a civilian government. They really do look forward to a day sooner than later, hopefully, where the government is totally distinct from the military.
Mm-hmm.
Until that time, however, they really rely upon the formal armed forces to take care of matters to get them to that point.
And do you think that this research that you're collecting now will translate at all to some of the other unrest happening at the same time in some of these other countries?
Well, I guess I want to answer that in 2 ways. I'm guessing you're asking about the findings again rather than the method.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have actually been tempted to go to Libya and these other places, but I don't think that I will. I sure hope so. I sure hope that what we, the mere telling of the story in its detail and its complexity, I think will be very valuable, so that one appreciates just what the magic was behind its success here. That will be useful to young people all over the world who want to emulate this. This has been a successful movement and an honorable movement because it's been nonviolent, and that's an important lesson that youth and adults all around the world need to learn. That's effective. That can be effective, again, depending on how it's responded to. So we would like her to know that how that happened, and how youth played their role, and so that we can help illustrate how successful resistance can be conducted. And then over the long term, I think we really want to be helpful in showing how it is that youth can move forward, and what are the factors in society and in political realms that really help move that forward, and which get in the way.